Hi, Bob. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Alex.
So, Bob, the primary question of this documentary is, can ESPN survive and flourish in a streaming world as it has in a traditional TV world? So to start, maybe I'll just ask you that broad question.
Sure. I believe that ESPN could be every bit the juggernaut it is in the streaming world as it has been in the cable world. The brand is so central. It is so powerful. It is so beloved by so many sports fans. At the same time, though, I do believe we have to recognize that the transition from a cable universe over to a streaming world is going to be one that's going to probably be fraught with challenges. If you look at the economics of the cable business, it's really been underwritten, if you will, by a lot of non-sports fans who are all been subscribers through their cable bundle for ESPN. And as you make that transition to a la carte subscription for ESPN in the streaming world, those folks won't come along for the journey. Therefore, the entire financial burden of paying back all those costs for sports rights are going to be borne by the sports viewers themselves. And I think that's going to make the pricing volume discussion really interesting, because obviously there's probably going to be some level of sticker shock that the sports fans are going to experience once that transition has happened.
Can you talk about that issue a little bit, Bob? Like, you must have done some research on that as Disney CEO. What do you think ESPN will need to charge in order for the math to work?
I think one way that you could look at it is to examine the percentage of people that really never tune into ESPN, that are cable subscribers, that are paying for it, and just assume that those consumers are off the table. And then you're going to probably have some light to medium users that may also depart because the much higher cost per month that they would necessarily be charged are probably going to exit as well. And you're sort of in a much smaller universe of heavy users and medium users that just love sports. And so I suspect that, when you compare it to the price of, say, an ESPN Plus today, roughly $12 a month, I think if people are expecting, well, it's ESPN Plus, it's ESPN streaming, it's going to be about the same, I think they're going to be in for a bit of a shock.
We're probably entering a world where the total number of ESPN subscribers is significantly less than what it was in the traditional TV's heyday, which was, say, 100 million U.S. households in the U.S. So if you're living in this smaller world, does ESPN run the risk of becoming less culturally relevant?
I think you're going to lose households, but those households, given my premise, aren't watching ESPN anyway. So I don't really think it changes their cultural relevance at all, because you'll carry with you this very same people who were watching before this.
You were at Disney for decades, and while you never ran ESPN, it became dominant while you were at the company, and at least dovetailed with several of the jobs you had as you climbed the ladder at Disney. Can you just sort of speak to how important ESPN has been to Disney through its history?
Well, ESPN is a critical part of the Disney portfolio of companies. I mean, in any one year, somewhere between 98 and 99 of the top 100 programs in terms of viewership are sports programs. When you're an advertising-driven business like Disney is, that ability to get an audience instantly is not something to be overlooked, because that isn't necessarily the case anymore with a lot of the businesses where you can essentially watch at your leisure. So for an advertiser who wants to get an audience right away, it's very, very important that you have something that people will watch live. And news certainly is one of those, but even more so live sports. And so I don't really think there's much of a risk that they're going to in any way become less relevant or less important as time goes on, given that shift to streaming.
Bob, you looked at spinning off ESPN while you were running Disney and ultimately decided not to. I'm just curious sort of how you thought about that process and why you decided that ESPN was sort of a essential part of Disney.
Well, there's really two factors that came into play. Number one, when I was CEO, it was a very interesting time in the history of the company because we had just taken on an extraordinary amount of debt to make the Fox acquisition. And then right on the heels of finishing that up, COVID hit, which means that the company had to take on even more debt to keep the company afloat. And so at that time, the idea of parting with a huge cash flow generator like ESPN was not even conceivable. So now as time goes on and you look at that in a rearview mirror, you start to ask yourself, what are the strategic benefits of ESPN being part of Disney? And I think the most important part there is not only the cash flow that ESPN brings, but also the fact that it's a critically important part of the streaming bundle for Disney. When you have Disney Plus and you have Hulu and you have ESPN Plus, the churn goes way, way down, and it represents a tremendous value to the consumer. And therefore, I think what ends up happening is that they don't churn as much. So it's a win-win for both Disney and for the consumer.
One thing Disney did since you've left is make ESPN its own vertical. When you were CEO, it was part of this larger group called Disney Media and Entertainment Distribution, or DMED. Why do you think Disney did this?
Well, I read what you read, and there's been some conversation about the possibility that Disney would spin off ESPN, or at least a portion of ESPN. And if you were preparing to do that, one might assume that a separation of the business that you were going to spin would be a wise move so that you don't, mix oceans, as they say. And so I could only see it as being a precursor for doing what they've already suggested that they're considering doing.
Let's talk about that, the idea of taking on strategic partners. You just sort of made the argument for why spinning ESPN didn't make sense to you. Does the idea of bringing on minority strategic partners make sense to you?
Well, there's already one minority strategic partner in Hearst. So this would be bringing on a second minority strategic partner. Obviously, the benefit of doing that is that you make available some cash. And given some of the conversation that's been happening between Comcast and Disney in terms of, needing to buy the final share of Hulu to make it wholly owned by the Disney company, it's possible that maybe that cash itself is what they're after. But strategically, I don't really see a benefit in bringing on yet another minority partner.
One idea I've reported you had is to sort of change ESPN's function in a way in a digital world, from a network of proprietary programming and sports rights to more of a portal for all live sports, no matter what network a game aired on. Can you explain your thinking about what that could look like down the road?
Alex, I always look at the business through a consumer-first lens. And as the number of outlets that broadcast sporting events has grown, and as the complexity and the schedule of those broadcasts gets more and more spread out, I sometimes think that we have a very suboptimal experience for consumers. I mean, you've got Sunday football games, you've got Sunday night football games, you've got Monday night football games, sometimes two at a time, just like we had last weekend. You've got Thursday night games, and now at the end of the season, you've got Saturday games. And you've got a myriad of outlets, including the streamers now, that are broadcasting these games. As close as I am to this business, sometimes I get confused as to where a game might or might not be. And it just seems incumbent upon the market leader in sports, as ESPN, that they've got an opportunity to simplify this. I mean, streaming is all about satisfying the customers with more personalized and more customized type experience. And if ESPN could somehow become a clearinghouse or a central hub for directing consumers and viewers to whatever shows they wanted, I think that would be a huge win and add extra value. And I'll give you an analogy, Alex, that makes perfect sense to me. If I'm on my Apple TV and I want to watch a movie, I have no idea whether it's on Prime or Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu, wherever it's at. The way I find out is I go to Apple TV I plug in the movie that I'm looking to watch, and they direct me exactly to where that movie is. And then they connect me seamlessly without me then having to exit and go to another app to go find the show on that app. And I think ESPN, again, being that juggernaut that we talked about, should be that source for a central clearinghouse. Now, for that to happen, you're going to have agreement from the leagues and agreements from the other broadcasters. But I think if you put the consumer first, that is absolutely something that should be done.
So just to be clear here, it's almost as if you are envisioning ESPN as not only traditional content network, but also platform, digital platform.
I think it's got the opportunity to do that. And I think it would be wise for that option to at least be considered. Again, it's going to take the cooperation of a lot of different players, a lot of different constituents in the ecosystem to make that happen. But there's nobody else in my mind that can do that, because ESPN is the epicenter of sports. And if you're really going to take a consumer first viewpoint, that is the role that ESPN should take as the market leader, not only to broadcast games that they buy rights to just like everybody else, but how do you separate yourself? How do you make yourself different? How do you make yourself indispensable to the sports viewer so that they stay on with you as you evolve over to a streaming world? And I think solving that problem would be one big way to do it.
So I know this is John Skipper's point of view. He basically thinks that the lifeblood of ESPN is owning live sports rights. And as far as I see it, the fundamental problem for ESPN, or even Disney, is that you're entering a world now where Amazon, Apple, and Google are competing for live sports rights instead of what we've seen over the past several decades, where it's been smaller pocketed traditional broadcast networks like Fox or NBC or CBS, or even cable networks like TBS and TNT that have been the primary competition. So I guess my question is, how can ESPN afford to compete in this new world?
I don't think you could afford to compete just by buying up every right that exists, because it just would not be economically viable for your subscribers to pay the kind of monthly charge that would be necessary to, essentially garner up all those rights. So that might have been possible in years back. I would even doubt that, but it certainly is impossible now. So I think if you're going to have some of the rights, now look at the NHL. ESPN, basically dominates distribution of the NHL games. But in football, NFL football, that is not the case at all. They've got Monday Night Football, and you're never going to be able to own all of NFL football. So if that's the case, that dream of, essentially being one-stop shopping for every single program is probably not viable. But as we talked earlier, you can point consumers there so that the very first place they have to stop before they go watch their game and maybe watch some shoulder programming about the game is ESPN. And so I think the idea would be fantastic, but I just don't think it's economically viable. And therefore, that shoulder programming that I referenced, the programming about the game, either before the game or after the game, or just in the context of the sport, is going to be critically important as ESPN decides to try to fill in what they can't buy in terms of sports rights.
Bob, just to pick up on some of that shoulder programming, I'm curious if you think studio programming like SportsCenter will remain relevant in a streaming-first world.
I think an evolved version of SportsCenter will be as important in a streaming world as it has been in a cable world. And what I mean by an evolved version of it is that over time, the needs of the viewers change. And I think any broadcaster is going to have to change with it. For example, sports betting is a critical part for the younger audience of the sports experience. More programming that would cover sports betting or fantasy. Fantasy is another area that the younger viewers just absolutely insist on. You could have every argument as to why a company like Disney wouldn't want to be involved in sports betting, but your viewership absolutely requires it because it's an integral part of their experience. And so if you're going to be in the sports business, you pretty much have to be in that. And I think that needs to be reflected not only in how the games are broadcast, but also how that shoulder programming itself plays out and who it appeals to.
The biggest rights deal that was done during your era as CEO was the Monday Night Football deal. You guys spent a lot of money on Monday Night Football. Can you just briefly tell us why Monday Night Football is so important to ESPN?
Well, if you're the market leader in sports, you've got to have the NFL. And I think Monday Night Football was a fixture. And I think it lost a little of that glimmer. And as a result, we worked to try to come up with the NFL with something that could bring that shine back to Monday Night Football. And I think the Manning cast, which transpired during the time that I was CEO, came to be, is exactly the type of innovative programming where you take the rights that you already have and you bring them out into the marketplace with a whole new perspective. I mean, that is the perfect example in my mind of what's going to have to happen for ESPN to continue to be that juggernaut in a streaming world that it is in a cable world. And when you need programming like the NFL, and you've got an opportunity in history with Monday Night Football, you can't just broadcast the same way that you did 10, 20, 30 years ago. You've got to do it in a way that's more modern, more fresh, and let consumers choose, let the viewers choose between, a traditional broadcast, which some people may prefer, but also this sort of more modern way to watch a game through the eyes of these two football legends. And I believe more of that's going to be what's necessary in order for the streaming world to be as successful and lucrative as the cable world was.
For decades, ESPN has been a one-size-fits-all product in a way. Like either you get ESPN and cable or you don't. But maybe we're entering a world, in a digital world, where ESPN starts tiering its pricing. So if you're the really hardcore sports fan, you get everything. But maybe that way it can try to broaden its audience by offering multiple prices and multiple products.
Customization and personalization in this world, whether it's sports or not, is absolutely critical because that's what people expect now with the technological enabling that's possible from a viewership standpoint as it pertains to sports or any other business, Alex. And so that is something that I assume that they're looking at because you can get a much broader audience. Maybe you tier your prices, maybe you tier your products. I think that's a very interesting idea.
As you think about what ESPN means to the culture, to American culture, to world culture, how would you describe that?
Well, I think it's your close sports buddy that's with you at all times. And I say that, Alex, because during my time at Disney, people say, where do you work? You say it, and if they're a sports fan, ESPN necessarily comes up. When people travel, for example, business people, when they go back to the room and they're by themselves, they turn on ESPN. And it's just their background noise because I think it's their companion. It's a kinship, it's a friendship. It's somebody that you trust, somebody that has common interest. And I think they see it as a sports buddy. And I think ESPN every bit has the opportunity to continue that in the streaming world for those fans that decide that, it's worth it for them to go ahead and continue having that sports buddy with them 24/7.
Bob, do you expect that we're headed to a world, a streaming world, where we have some sort of facsimile of a cable bundle and ESPN is part of that?
I think it's always possible. There seems to be an endless cycle of bundling and unbundling and bundling and unbundling, and neither of them are ever perfect, but I guess it's possible. It's not something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but as the world now becomes more and more disparate and tougher for the viewers to, kind of keep track of what's where, I think that's always a possibility.